Hi everyone. What we're going to be doing in this exercise is creating a game asset that could go into Unity. It's pretty basic well here. And if we look at it right here inside of Unity, what we're basically trying to do is get this thing to blend in with this scene. So I'll be giving you the description on where to download this scene and make sure it's set up for me. So this is what we're going to be doing. So let's look at Maya. Right now we have our scene, and it's actually done using some repeating textures. And you can see we have a wood grain, which I'll give you an example of that in our project description. And we also have some shingles. And on the bottom, we have some rocks. And those rocks are bricks. All these things are normal mapped. So this is a very basic model, and it's nice because I can actually create a lot of different things with this setup. Let's say that if I wanted to create a brick wall, I can easily take something like this and go into my Stingray and assign the material to this. Now, right now, the wall is not unwrapped the way I want that to be, but if I were to change this thing out inside of my UV editor, and I'm just going to tell this to cut and then stack the shells so I can scale that up from 0 to 1. And if I go just to go into my UV, and holding down the X key, snap that to the grids, I should be able to use this as a repeating wall. Bear with me, we'll see. Okay. And now if we go back into my classic, and I know some of this might glitch, like the top I'd have to unwrap a little bit better, but we have ourselves something that if I were, let's scale this up a little bit, to use this and make that into a modular piece, I'm going to move down my pivot point to over here. And let's just say Control D to duplicate, and then holding down the V key. You'll see that this actually repeats over and over and over again. So very easy way to make a modular set piece for our environment. And it doesn't take that long to do that. So let's get into how to create these things, and then I'll get into Photoshop and show you how to texture that up. Inside of our shingles layer that I've got right here, I have this layer that shows you that repeating texture. And again, if I hit the D key, hold on the V key, snap it to that bottom corner, and duplicate it. And it's going to key off of those other ones to snap. So just got to make sure that yep, there we go. And there we go. I have, that didn't snap 100% to his buddy. Alright. Just because I have the geometry on the background and I'm lazy right now. So you can see this is normal mapped. It looks pretty good. And it is repeating. And this is a very easy thing to do. If we look, let me go back a little bit further at what I started with. I made a plane. And the plane doesn't really matter so much as the grid that's behind it. So right now, I'm going to add that to another layer just to hide it. You can see that I had this stuff going on back here. This is the thing I'm making the normal maps off of. So this grid is basically telling me how that I could, or this polygon is telling me how I could work off of that. You can see the grid points here. It's right now lining up with the size of my square, which is helpful because when I create these, I can make sure that it's going to stay inside of that the scale of this or the dimensions of this plane. Now you'll notice it goes over that, and that's on purpose because I want to make sure that I'm getting enough geometry captured with my normal map to be able to bake this thing. Because if it was like this big, you're not going to have the whole thing baked. You're going to have holes in that. So we want to make sure it's something where you have the repeating pieces back here going over the size of the plane that we're using. And so let's kind of deconstruct what we have here. All this is a cylinder that has been squished down. So when I took this thing, I ended up grabbing my vertices and moving these up. And now I applied, I can just grab these, and if I hit bevel, it'll add a little bit of some more edges on there. The first time I did this, by the way, it didn't pop. It didn't have enough normal map on there, and the ambient occlusion was really bad. It was because it really was just too sharp of an object. So take advantage of the fact that if this is going to be a high poly model, use high poly. So we can smooth that up a little bit more, and that's pretty good. So now that I have this, all I basically did is, let's snap that to the grid, and duplicate, bring it over, duplicate, bring it over, duplicate, bring it over. And we'll go in the opposite direction as well. Okay. So now that I have this, I can combine all these. Let me just do a couple more just to be safe. Over here and over here. Okay. I'm going to combine all these. So mesh, combine. I'm going to duplicate. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. And let's offset this. So I'm just going to hold down the X key again and snap it over 1. So now that I have this is what I'm going to use as just determining what that template of the shingles will be. So if we look at this, not much to it, but what we could do to get some depth off of this is to increase our rotate on the Z. So I'm going to tell this maybe about 8. Tell that one 8 as well. You want to make sure they're the same. Now that I have that, we can grab both of these, combine them. We want to make sure if we hold down, press D, snap that back to the grid. So X, snap it to the grid. Okay. This is how easy this is. Control D, snap it down to the next grid point. D, snap it down. D, Control D, Control D. Alright, so now I have something like this. This is looking pretty good. If we want to make sure there's no gaps underneath this, there is a trick that we could do too. Just in case if you do see, like I'm seeing some holes there. But I'm also noticing, let me turn off my grid, and I'm going to go into my top view. I'm noticing that due to lack of sleep, I'm not duplicating these in ways I should. You can see that these are loose and these are tightly oriented, so what we would need to do is just hold down the X key and bring those up. So we've fixed that. There we go. And we can just make some more. Alright, so we have this thing. That would fit in there, so we know that that would work. Let's kind of look at what we have there. So if I kept this shape, and let's just make another one just to prove that point. So if I scale this thing up, let's say it's like 10. And I do not need any width or height in my subdivisions. It's just a plane I need. Okay. So I know that over here would repeat over there, and this would repeat over there. So this is good. I actually made this maybe a little bit too big compared to the other one, but what I could do is snap that into the center and then scale this thing up on the X, Y, and Z, so maybe 15. Okay, so now that's just going to give me more resolution in there. So let's use this. I'm going to use this thing as my low poly, so we'll export that. And I already have this set up for baking. I like to keep it inside of a folder that I know it's not going to be a game object or anything like that. It's just going to be the thing I want to use to be able to work with these objects. And so it's a good idea to call it something like for bakings or whatever that is. I call it for baking. This is just because I already have that one set up, so I had to differentiate that one. But if I have that in there, I'm going to make this an OBJ. And that's going to be my, let's call this shingles low. And the rest of these, whoop, there we go, will be my shingles high. So I'm going to export these. And so we'll call that shingles high. All right, let's go over to X normal. Let's set this thing up. I'm going to import. So I need to add a mesh. So if I right click over here, go to add mesh. And in my for bakings folder, my shingles high is what I'm going to add. And my low def, I'm going to remove that one that was there. Go to add meshes, shingles low. Okay. What do I want to bake? Well, I want to have my normal map, and I want an ambient occlusion. And I also want this thing called a curvature map. And what we want to make sure that when we're doing this is set to 2 colors. So now that we have that, close that. And I need to make sure my name for the output is set. So if I go into here, a little dot, 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 it's inside the for bakings, that's good. And we could tell it to go into textures. You'll notice I already have these set up here. But we'll make a new folder. So we'll call this textures. And this will be shingles. Hit generate maps. Let it do its thing. It's going to take a little bit of time to generate the ambient occlusion, and it's also going to take some time to generate that curvature map. But you'll notice, slowly but surely, it's going through. And there we go. It's rendering out my curvature map. Another thing to talk about while this is doing this, I have my size set to 1024 by 1024, and 16 and 32 is for the edge padding and bucket size. Usually we can leave that alone in case if anything kind of shows up wonky on our textures, if we have transparencies or something like that with our shells that we have. We usually would change that, but for now we'll leave that alone. Okay. And now that's done. So let's look at what this did. And to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and make a new layer. And this is, we'll call this tutorial shingles. Don't name it that. This is just so I can have it. And then we'll use this to test this out. So how do we get this to work? We need to go into Maya and we will create a material. And that is a Stingray PBS. So that is a physically based shader. And when we have that, we will make sure we name it. So shingles. And now inside of here, let's just graph that out so we can see it. So right click graph network. Inside of here, we want to add. For some reason, this hasn't been updating tonight. I don't know why, but it says that it has stuff in here. This isn't actually the shingles. This is another material. So I'm just going to move that aside and go over here. Oh, Maya and all of your glitches. So let me go back here. I need to add, for my shingles, my normal map. So I'll link that in. And we'll go into textures, and I have my normals. So there's that. And let me go back again. So press that, and then we are going to add our ambient occlusion map for now, just to test that out. So we have our occlusion. So now that I have that, I'm just going to have my shingles, which you can't see over on in the hypershade on my other monitor. I'm going to go into assign material to selection. Oops. Wrong one. And nothing happened. Well, that is because inside of the Stingray shader, we need to make sure we have the use in the attribute. So in the attribute, we need to have use normal map, and we also need the ambient occlusion. Okay, we're on to something. Let's verify that this is repeating. So if I snap that over here, duplicate, and hold down the V key, I'm seeing some errors. So clearly, I did something wrong. Notice that where you would expect this to start repeating again, it's giving me that little tiny shingle. So don't freak out. That's not the worst thing in the world. What we can do is look at our shingles and try and figure out what it was that caused that. So if we go into shingles, we look at this object underneath it. We go to top view here. Okay, that's why. It is going beyond the edges. So if I go into show grid, yep, I made a object that is beyond the size that I should be working with. So it's not actually it's not lining up with that grid, so it's not going to snap the way it should be. If I look for maybe 14, and I'm also going to modify center this pivot of this object again so I can snap it to the grid a little bit easier to see. Okay. I'm also going to turn off that texture so I can kind of just see what this is going to grab. I know that that's going to grab it there, and this looks a lot better. So I was off on my size, and I also wasn't really paying attention to the way that my top and bottoms were lining up. So this looks like it's lining up a lot better, and all I'd have to do is export this one. So if I go to export selection, and I'm just going to do the low, and then now in here, it's going to reload all that already. I don't need to re-import that one again. I'll just tell this to generate again. And it's going to ask you, do you want to override the other ones you did? Yes. Okay. This is already looking a lot better. So I'm going to let this do its thing. I'm going to go back inside of here. And now. Yes, I'll take it. Okay. Yep. Inside of here, I already have my Windows settings and preferences. If you go inside of here, I already have this set up to take my textures and re-link those. So inside of files and projects under image files, automatically reload updated image files. That way I don't have to do that by hand. It's a lot easier when I'm working with textures. And you notice this is already fixed right here. So if I start to move these around, way better. Okay, we fixed it. Good. So we have the shingles. Those are done. Let's go into rocks. All right, this is the final rock material that's on top. So let me hide that again into my layer so we don't have to see it. This is how I did it. Now this did take about 20 minutes to 30 minutes of my time. It was not fun. And for me, repetitive things like this are just not fun. The way I did this, you'll notice this rock is the same as this rock. And every single one of these edge rocks correspond to these rocks. And I'm sure you're already guessing it. These correspond to these. All the other ones you don't need to worry about because they're not lying on an edge. So this is a pretty easy way to be able to make a really nice 3D looking normal map of rocks. And to do that, all this was a cube. And I would take that cube, maybe pull it out a little bit like this, go into multi-cut, maybe cut it up a couple times, and then bend it around. Just push some vertices, something like that, and then maybe grab the edges of this, and then hit bevel, and then from there hit smooth. Now I have a brick, and it has a little bit of a more stylized edge to it. Now I have a brick that I could use like this, and I can use it like that, and I can use it like this. Remember that there's multiple surfaces when you're creating this thing. And then we can also go in and then try to make it look like some of these are a little more unique than the other ones. That way, when people are playing this game, they don't just stare at your rock and say, man, that texture artist was lazy. I really wish I could meet them so I could throw that brick at them. Don't do that. Realize that there's a lot you can get away with by just rotating and moving these things around. And then there is the matter of just creating more of them. And then doing something like this. And then bevel, smooth. And this is just that same concept where you're adding more and more of these things around. So that's how I did this. There's no magic to it. It just takes some time. Every time I look at this one, I cringe because I did this very quickly, but the output works pretty well. Now, you're going to notice after a while when you're working on these things, the pivot point is going to get strange. And that can be a problem. So let's say that I do have like one more of these things. And I'm trying to work with this. And let's say, let me just get rid of those. I want to put it over here. Get rid of those too. All right. So if I were to do that, how in the heck can I get that over there? So it's just a matter of holding down the X key and snapping it over. And once that X snaps on that grid point that you know is going to be where you want that to repeat over, you'll want to duplicate, hold down the X key, and then bring it over to the other side. Now, do not make adjustments to just one of these. You need to make adjustments to both. If you just adjust one of these rocks, it's going to break that ability to repeat. So right now I can see that that was already gigantic. I just can't work with it. So I'll scale that down, making sure I'm still on that pivot point, or that grid point, and Control D, and duplicate it over. And then after you get everything that you like, I also make sure I have a plane that's there that represents that the boundary. And from there, it's just a matter of having another plane that we'll use as our low res hovering above this. If it were inside of it, you would have some cutoff geometry, so it's a better idea to just hover that geometry above, and we'll use that as the low res, and we'll use the rest of these as the high res. So we would bake that next normal the same way we had the other ones. And then, if we were to go inside of our textures here, this is how we can get to that final detail. And the way we can get to this level is actually pretty easy. Let's go into Photoshop to look at what my bake ended up looking like. So, in Photoshop, I'm just going to press everyone that I don't need. There we go. Let's look at my bakes. I have this ambient occlusion bake, and I have some other things going on here, and it's put together in a way that looks really nice. But if we break this down, this is just an ambient occlusion and another ambient occlusion. These are set to multiply. That's just to kind of push the depth of these bricks a little bit further. Should have changed it from black to maybe a brown, because this is super cheese the way that color looks. But this is a quick demo. Don't use black for anything in textures. It should be brown. All right. This is moss that I added, and I have a special way to do that, and it's going to only go into areas where it's dark, and it's going to use our curvature map. Then I also have the curvature map that's going to give me some highlight on my brick and push back some more brick space. And then last but not least, if I turn off everything, I have a repeating rock texture, and that will be provided for you guys. All right, so let's see how we started this. So I'm going to do a new, and 1024 with 1024 with 72 res is fine. I'm going to go and open up my stone's occlusion and stone's curvature. Okay, so that's my curvature map. It looks horrifying. I love it. And my occlusion is this one. Oh, no, it's not. I have so many things open, so bear with me here. Just open it in again, I guess. Let's see. There we go. Okay, it wanted to disappear. We'll just place it into our new dock then, so. See if that disappeared on me. No. Alright. So I have that new dock. I'm going to place my images in there. So, place. Stone's occlusion. Hit enter. And we'll start with this one. To get the appearance of stone, we just got to use a texture that repeats behind it. So if I were to place a texture of stone, and it looks like this, I'm going to move this underneath that ambient occlusion, and I'm going to turn that to multiply. And right away, you have a really bad looking texture. So we got something. But we want to push some depth on this. We want to make it look really, really nice. And so let's see what we can do. I'm going to actually duplicate my multiply to see if I can push those back even further. And let's go into, let's actually place our stone's curvature. Now you'll notice it looks haunted. It's using red and green to represent curvature. Anything is kind of red is starting to go back into space, and the green is more forward. So it's kind of how that's generating those maps. And what we could do with this is separate the black or the red and the green from each other. So I'm going to duplicate this layer. And I'm actually going to make a layer above that one and above this one. And let me group this and just call this curvature work, and move that above all this stuff so I'm not messing with my other pieces. So we'll just call this stone work. So the curvature, I'm going to make a solid color, and I'm going to make sure that it is 255 on my art. Your G and your B need to be 0. If you do that and hit Shift F5 and fill it with a foreground color, it is going to be 100% red. So what we could do with this is actually go from normal to subtract. And notice what it did to the layer underneath it. It took all the red out of that curvature map. So I like that. I'm actually going to merge those two layers. So I just have this green. Now with this one, I need this to be green on 255. And this one will be 0. Again, Shift F5 to fill, hit OK. And turn that one to subtract. And what this is going to do is subtract the green from that curvature map. And now I have a green curvature map and a red curvature map. We're going to use this red curvature map to make moss. And to do that, excuse me, I'm going to go into my adjustments. And I'm going to go into my saturation and just drop out the saturation from here. Okay. Now that I have this, I need to grab my moss material that is provided for you guys. So I'm going to place this. Hit enter. And I'm going to make a alpha channel. And I want to use this as my alpha channel. So if I hit Control A and Control C, and then I try to paste that into here, Control V, it's not going to do it. It's going to pop up above that. So there's actually a very easy way to be able to work with that. Whoop. Let me get back into my viewport here. All right. So to be able to work with this, if I want to work with this alpha mask, but be able to use this black and white image in there, we just have to make sure that we hold down Alt, click on that mask, and it's going to turn white. This is allowing for us to work specifically within that mask. So if I hit Control V now I'm pasting that mask into, or I'm pasting this image into that mask. And you'll notice what it did. It's not all that interesting yet. All it did was take that little bit of gray and white and then push that into there. If we want to emphasize that even more, what we could do is increase the contrast of that mask. So let's go into brightness contrast. I'm going to go and increase my brightness. I'm actually going to reduce the contrast. And let's move this down a little bit. Turning off this one. You notice what it did. So I have this one. Let's say that we put it on overlay. It doesn't look very good. Let's see what happens if it's multiply. It gets lost when I add it as really any of these other settings. We can mess around with it to find maybe one that would like. Linear light looks a little bit better. Linear dodge, lighter dodge, lighten, and then if we just go into normal, that's not bad. So right now it's a little bit nuclear, and that's because of the color that we're using. So if I go to my adjustments, I go into my hue and saturation. I'm also going to make sure I link it specifically to the layer underneath there by holding down Alt and then left clicking. You'll notice it's going to have that little arrow. And if I mess around with my saturation on this and then try to change the colors a little bit, probably will find a little bit more of an interesting moss color that's not nuclear looking. Okay, I like that. Now, if I want to add more moss to areas inside of here, if I have the mask selected and I go up into here, now, if it's white and it's at opacity of like 100%, it's going to be very obvious where you're painting. So you probably want to make it so the opacity is very subtle and low. And we also want to work with Let's see. Let's just go to soft round. See what this does. I usually have my walking tablet, but I didn't connect that for right now. Go back and change some of that up. If we hit the X button, it'll switch our colors. And you can see how you can start to build up some moss. Maybe you only want it on a little bit of the top spots. But this is a fast way to be able to work up a fairly realistic looking texture here. Anytime you're near the edge, make sure that you bring that over to the other side. We can always offset this image too to paint that to make sure that our strokes come across both sides. For the sake of not making you guys watch the whole thing, we'll say that this is done for now. And I'm going to see what happens if I move this down, these two down and underneath my multiply. I'm going to put it in, I'm going to sandwich it between these two ambient occlusions that are set to multiply. I just think that looks a little bit nicer. Okay. Now that I have something like this going on, it's starting to come together. And if we look at the reference that I was working with, there was my original one that I was showing you guys earlier, and here's where this one is. I want to add a little bit more definition on here. And what I want to do is take that curvature that was for the height and add that as well. So if I take that, I'm going to duplicate this one again. And image adjustments, I'm going to desaturate this one. I'm also going to go into my brightness and contrast. And I'm going to drop my contrast, bring up the brightness. And let's say maybe something like that. I'm going to drag that into my stone work, and I'm going to turn off this stuff. And let's see with multiply. That's just way too much. However, if I were to swap through on a number of these, color dodge isn't looking good. Overlay is something interesting. Soft light is giving me an interesting look to it as well. Hard light is just way too intense. Linear light is too intense as well. So this is a matter of experimenting with these. And usually you'll know, difference is just way too crazy. So if we go into the one that I want to use right here, maybe it can be something like overlay. And it's a little too much. Alright, I'm going to try soft light. And I'm also going to add an adjustment layer of my brightness and or actually let's use levels this time. I'm going to make sure it's only connecting to this layer right here. So if I hold on Alt and click here, and I'm going to try and make the highlights pop and the background pieces kind of recede a little bit, and just give some more three-dimensionality to this. Not too much. And again, I can always adjust my opacity on this as well. Oops, I adjusted the opacity of this. I wanted to do that with this one. Okay, maybe around here, and then the soft light is even more extreme. Alright, I'm going to say that I like that. And let's go ahead and have this linked in. I'll use the one I was working on before. And let's see what that would do. So we saw that it's in here. We have it applied to our well. So all this is right here is a cylinder that had its caps cut off. So if I cut the caps off, this is what I started with. And then if I were to add that material, you'll notice right away something weird is going on. Well, the cylinder naturally in the UV editor, it's not lining up right. It's actually not lining up well at all. It's a lot of different things that are bad for games. One of the things is it's in the middle of a UV set. It's not really utilizing that texture sheet as well as it could. Another thing it's also doing is it's kind of not taking advantage of the fact that this is a repeating texture. So I'm going to do that with this. I'm going to go and delete half of this off. And using that, I am going to go to my UVs and just snap these as much as I can and explode. I'm going to go to my shell and expand that out. And once I have that where I kind of think it's going to look good, just making sure I'm snapping these UVs to the 0 to 1. That way it will repeat. Not very concerned that those UVs are going to be a little bit longer because this should repeat pretty nicely. And duplicate that, and now I can just rotate that over 180 degrees. And by doing that, I now have this with the same UV sets and mesh combine. We'll merge these. Okay. And now let's see what happens if we were to look at the UVs. Way better. Look at that. Okay. So now that we have that, there's some little tricks we can add too. So for very little cost, we can just add some edge loops. So multi-cut will go maybe around here and maybe here. And then just double click, scale that down. Scale that up. I can also go in maybe selecting half of this and then kind of pulling that out. You don't want to go too extreme. This is maybe too extreme on that. So just enough where we have this thing feeling more organically created. Just the tube is kind of too boring. So I kind of like to do that with my objects if I can, just to make it feel like it's more realistic, or it's got some variation, at least to the silhouette at least. So all right, not bad. Now how did I create this thing? This is just a it looks like a pipe, and the tutorial on how to create this texture is provided for you guys in our sheet. But how did I create the wood? Well, the wood is done by going into our cube, and let's say if I want this thing to repeat around, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm going to go into the settings for the cube, and I want this thing to be 8 for my depth. And I want this to be 7 for the subdivisions. So now, oops, sorry, 8 there. This is what I'm going to work with on this. And I'm also going to get rid of the caps on this side and that side. Let's look at our UVs. And you'll notice I am using the UV editor as I'm modeling. It just saves you a lot of time to do that instead of going around and dealing with these things before it gets a little too complicated. So I got to unfold. That's not going to work. Let's see. We could try to do an unfold along. Let's see, maybe. Nah, we'll just do an automatic on that, and it should line itself up. I'm going to go to edge just to ensure. And I'm going to start from here. I'm going to double click to the bottom. And then let's just say stitch together. Here to there, stitch together. Here to there, stitch together. So now these are all stitched. And let's keep it about there. And okay, now that this is all set, I'm going to use my mesh tools. Actually, let's go to deform, nonlinear bend. And we need to change that bend because right now the bend, let me get out of UV editor so I can actually see everything. The bend needs to rotate down on my X, so I'm going to tell this to rotate 90. And I'm also going to tell this thing to use a curvature of 180. Oops, 90. There we go. All right. I'm going to delete my history and duplicate that. Rotate it on the Y 180. And I'm going to combine these two. So mesh combine. And whoop. Let's just, I'm just going to use the old-fashioned way. Edit mesh, merge to center. This one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, and this one. Okay, so I've got this thing. Let's see what happens when I add that wood texture to it. Okay, I've got some seams here, but it shouldn't be too bad as a background object in a scene. And so this is how I ended up making this. Why did I do this instead of using a cylinder? Or why did I do this instead of making a tube or a pipe? Well, it's because this thing allows me to work with the a plane and then just to modify that. The UVs I feel are a lot easier to work with. All right, how do I get the inside of the wishing well? Well, you can see all I did was duplicate the outside, scale it in. And when I scale it in, let's hold down the this tool right here. So we're scaling it just on the X and the Z, so we don't shrink it on the Y, because when we scale it down here, it's going to scale all of those. We also need to reverse this one because you need it to be in the opposite direction. So mesh display reverse. Okay, that's looking pretty good. The rest of this is pretty straightforward on it. Cylinder that I made. This is just a plane that I cut up and positioned. Another box. This is the basics of how I created these things. Now, this was done the same exact way in materials. I ended up creating in Photoshop. I used my ambient occlusion, and then I took a material that was a slate look. I'll provide that for you as well. My color that I got off of that was adding color of purple above it. I linked that down, and it was set to around 26% for me. Doesn't need to be purple. This is not even anything I used for that one. So let me get rid of that. And don't be like me. I whipped this up to show you guys. The way to get the appearance of moss was to add again the curvature map and to set it as the recessed areas that have that moss on it. I bet you if we duplicate that layer, you can increase that as well if you wanted to. And the way to get some highlights onto the tops of my shingles was to get the reverse side of the curvature map and then have that set to soft light. And of course, multiply is on top to give me that shadow. Okay, so these were all the different little passes on how to get this hull set up. And from here, we will bring that into Unity. And to do that, we can have our model selected. Go to File, Export Selection, and we want to make sure that when it's exported, let's just combine this first. Make sure it's named. So, well, File, Export Selection. We want that to be an FBX. We also want to make the Embed Media checkbox on. And we'll export that. And inside of Unity, we would import that into our models folder. And then in here, we will create materials. So we'll go to Create, Material, and then you'll notice that we can click on these little dots to link in our color, which is albedo, metallic, which is our specular, our normal map, which is our normal map, and occlusion. So that's how we get these things going. Now, one last little trick that I ended up using to get those speculars and all those other little cheats that I did. So I ended up taking the color map that I generated, and I went in and I brought this into Normal Map Online, and I generated my specs off of that. Now you will want to adjust your strengths and your ranges on that to be able to get this optimized for what you want that to look like, because you'll notice it can be very shiny. So this is how I ended up getting all these other maps plugged in. I also want to make sure displacement is off, because that is not something that we would be working with right now. So that's how we would plug in all these different pieces.